1978, an American sitcom, situation comedy, named Different Strokes. It was aired on NBC about two black boys from Harlem, Willis Jackson, played by Todd Bridges, and Arnold Jackson, played by Gary Cole, who are welcomed into the home and family of a wealthy white businessman named Philip Drummond, who was played by Conrad Bain, after the death of their mother, who had been Drummond's housekeeper. The weekly sitcom ran until March 7, 1986, a pretty long run, almost 8 years, every week. The lesson of Lazarus and the unnamed rich man in Luke 16 is, of course, no comedy. But it is a different take on different strokes. Unlike Willis and Arnold Jackson in Different Strokes, Lazarus was never noticed. Unlike Willis and Arnold Jackson, his presence was not noticed by the rich man who was in his gate. When we say in his gate, meaning at the front of town, in the marketplace. Although the rich man called about Lazarus by name after they died, the lesson does not reflect that the rich man ever called Lazarus' name or noticed him when it mattered, when they were both alive. According to the lesson, he paid Lazarus no attention. Lazarus was of no concern. The rich man lived and died as if Lazarus did not matter. His poverty didn't matter. His physical weakness didn't matter. His hunger didn't matter. His vulnerability didn't matter. The only time Lazarus mattered to the rich man was when the rich man needed something. The only time Lazarus was noticed was when the rich man couldn't help himself. When the rich man needed relief from suffering in the afterlife, notice, in the afterlife, after Lazarus had suffered, after Lazarus had died, after Lazarus had gone without all that the rich man had in abundance, then and only then in the lesson does the rich man, who's unnamed, notice Lazarus. Notice how Jesus twists the narrative. It is not the rich man who is named. Now, we have heard the name Dives, but Dives is simply Latin for rich man. Dives was not his rich man. And we preachers have been guilty of misnaming the rich man when Jesus did not name him. And we have also been guilty of other things in connection with that passage. Dr. Gardner Taylor has said that he once heard a fellow preach this text and said he knew the name of the dogs. And he, reading from the King James Version, he read, "Moreover, the dogs." And you said the dogs were named Moreover. Moreover, the dogs. We look at the room. We preachers have been guilty of misusing this text and torturing this text, but beyond that humorous aside that Dr. Taylor shared, there is this different strokes kind of theme that runs throughout this passage. It is as if Lazarus and the rich man occupied different worlds in this life. And this lesson reminds us about the different world reality of inequality, of inequity. Inequity matters. We are dealing in this text with income inequality. There was a man who was rich, and he feasted sumptuously and dressed in purple, the color of wealth and affluence, and had plenty. And then there was a poor man. We see income inequality. We see health inequality. We do not read of the rich man having any pain in life, even the pain of indigestion. We see nothing about the rich man that suggests that there was anything about his life that was miserable other than his morality. And on the other hand, we see how Lazarus is described as a miserable person. He's poor, he is sick, covered with sores, he is hungry, and though he is hungry at a place where a rich man has food to spare, his hunger goes unquenched. It isn't that there is not food enough. It is that there is not feeling enough. We deal here with residential disparity. The rich man lived surrounded by wealth, comfort, and opulence, and Lazarus lounges almost like a homeless person. We don't know where Lazarus lives. We just know where Lazarus languishes. And that is an effort by Jesus to highlight the reality of inequality. The reality of inequality that we oftentimes do not focus on when we read this text. And if I may, the first lesson in this text for us is that inequality matters. Inequality matters. If anything we see in this text, it is that it matters when people don't have enough to eat. It matters when people do not have a place to stay. It matters when they do not have access to good health care. It matters when people do not notice them. It matters when people who have more than enough do not do anything to help them. It matters. Inequality matters. And the second thing we see in this text is that we see what happens when people don't think about inequality. What happens to us? What happens to us when people do not think about inequities? What causes us to think that inequities should not be thought about? What happens when we can see suffering people and not think about it? What happens in us when we see suffering on TV? When we see suffering in our faces, when we see suffering in our communities, and we don't think about it, we become used to it. And we turn the channel. Or we wait for another program to come on. Or we wait for something else to happen. Or we drive on by. What causes us to think that we don't need to think about the inequality we see? What causes us to think that God has caused it? What causes people to think that wealthy people exist because God loves them so much? God has blessed them so much. You've heard folks say, the Lord blessed me, and the Lord blessed me with a bigger house. The Lord blessed me with a bigger car. The Lord blessed me. I've been blessed and highly favored because I'm living large. There's nothing in this text that says that the rich man wasn't blessed, but there's nothing in this text that the man was rich because he was blessed. This text is silent about how the rich man acquired his wealth. We do not know whether he earned it by work or whether he inherited it, like the Waltons. We do not know whether he got it by good industry or whether he stole it by deceit. We do not know whether the rich man was honest or heinous. We only know he was wealthy. But there is a tendency for us to think that God ordains for some people to be wealthy. And again, we will misquote text. We'll quote Jesus and say, the poor you will have with you always. Jesus said that, but Jesus didn't say why they were poor. Jesus said, you'll have them with you always, which suggests you have to always be mindful of them. On the other hand, what causes us to think that impoverished people struggle because God doesn't like them? The reason they're poor is because you're just bad. If you weren't so bad, you would have more. I've heard people say that. Oh yeah, if they would just live better, if they would just work harder, if they would save their money more. Oh, you understand, when you're living like Lazarus with your back against the wall, you don't have money to save. When you're living with your back against the wall, even everyday occurrences that mean surprising expenses dive you further into poverty. You don't have a buffer. You don't have a rainy day fund. You don't have a cushion. You're already down with your back against the wall. And if something happens to drop you further down, then you just get lower on the wall. You don't have enough place to push back. This lesson doesn't explain why Lazarus was impoverished. Doesn't explain why he was sick. We don't know whether he was sick because there was sickness in his family. We don't know whether he was sick because he was sick because of his poverty. And the reality is that if one is poor, one is more often likely than not susceptible to a lot of illnesses that people who are affluent don't get, because we just don't think about people who are poor having no resources, not having the resistance to fight off illness. We don't know whether he was hungry because he had wasted his food or whether or not he had lost his food. Somebody had taken his food, or maybe people had stole his crops. What if somebody had robbed Lazarus? We don't know. We don't know whether the rich man was honestly wealthy or Lazarus was honestly poor. It really doesn't matter. The difference is that they were in different worlds, and for one of them, the power to change both their worlds was at his hand. Lazarus could do nothing to make himself wealthy, but the rich man could have done much to have made his suffering because of poverty less real. And the third thing this lesson teaches is that it teaches it's wrong to believe that God is indifferent about all this, that God doesn't care. I began by saying inequality matters. I began secondly by saying that, we don't think about inequality. But the third point is that God isn't indifferent. God does care. God does see what the rich man didn't see. You do recall after both Lazarus and the rich man died, the rich man dies and the text says was buried. And Lazarus died and the angels took him to Abraham. Don't miss that. Don't miss that. Now, Lazarus didn't go to Abraham because he was poor in life. But the suggestion is that there was something about Lazarus that Abraham found favor. It wasn't his poverty. Perhaps it was his piety. Perhaps Lazarus refused to curse God, even in his suffering. Perhaps Lazarus refused to believe that God was unkind, even though the rich man was unkind. Even though life had been hateful toward Lazarus, Lazarus perhaps did not hate. I do not know, but it suggests by this text that there was something about Lazarus' condition that found favor with God, and there was something about the rich man's condition that God disfavored, and it wasn't his wealth. Remember now, Job, the lesson of Job, the story of Job is the richest man in the East, and Job's wealth didn't make him unfavorable with God. It wasn't his wealth that made him unpopular. Job was wealthy and popular with God. We are not popular with God because of our wealth or our poverty, but notice that God is not indifferent. God is not indifferent to how we use the power of our wealth. And God sees the inequities of our world and knows the plight of impoverished people. God knows how self-centered affluence can blind us and deafen us and numb affluent people to the sight and the sounds and the pain of their impoverished neighbors. And God not only sees and knows, God notes. God notes. N-O-T-E-S. You recall when the rich man called out to Abraham from Hades, not hell, Hades. We read hell and we think of, but that's the King James rendering. In the Greek it's Hades, the underworld, Sheol, and S-H-E-O-L in the Psalms, the underworld, the world of those who have departed but have not gone into paradise with God. In Hades, the rich man looked up. He had lived high, but now he was low. In Hades, the rich man looked up. He had lived high on the hog, but now he was sure enough low down. In Hades, he looked up, and guess who he saw? Lounging in the bosom of Abraham, his old neighbor Lazarus. And all of a sudden, his amnesia stopped, and he remembered Lazarus' name. All of a sudden, his vision cleared, and he saw Lazarus. All of a sudden, his sensibility was alerted, and he was mindful that Lazarus was languishing in the luxury of God's bosom, and he was languishing in the suffering of Hades. And all of a sudden, the rich man said, Father Abraham, send Lazarus. And here God notes with these two words, child, remember? Child, remember? You didn't think I noticed, did you? But in case you didn't think I noticed, child, remember, I noted that when you were in your life, you had your good things. You had your wealth. You had your affluence. You had food to spare. You had opportunities to serve, and to help, and to deliver people like Lazarus. In life, I noted what you did. Growing up at Route 1, Box 143, between Delight and Antoine in Pike County, Sue, Danny, and I would oftentimes remind ourselves when we were guilty of some infraction that we thought Mama and Daddy had told us, that even though Mama and Daddy didn't see, the Lord wrote it down. We would remind ourselves, the Lord wrote it down. God does notice, and God does note. God notes the things we take for granted, the inequality we take for granted. And God notes how powerful people treat the powerless. God sees our different worlds and sees our different behaviors towards the poor and the wealthy. God noticed how we make ways to make ways for folks who are wealthy. We'll create highways for rich folks. We will break up ground so rich folks can get where they want to go. And we will not create a place or a way for poor people to go. We will blow up roads. We'll tear down neighborhoods so rich folks can have somewhere. But we will not give people who are poor access. We will buy buildings and put schools where we want rich kids to go. But we will close schools in poor neighborhoods and require children in poor neighborhoods to have to be hauled by their parents to some place or go to schools with teachers who are not qualified to teach them. As if we do not care. God notes this. Child, remember is a message to us. Child, remember is a message that God does care about what oftentimes we think rich folks don't care about. It's a message not only to rich folks, but it's a message to poor people. It's a message to poor people to say, listen, don't think God doesn't see what you're going through. Don't think God doesn't know what you're dealing with. Don't think God doesn't hear what's happening to you. Don't think God doesn't care. And don't think God isn't noting, isn't calculating. There is a word in our language called reckoning. Reckoning. There is going to be a holy reckoning. God has a way of reckoning with our indifference. And so we have the last lesson, the reckoning of God. God saying, well, and again, notice he never calls the rich man by name. Abraham never calls the rich man anything but child. He never says the name that his parents gave him. He doesn't call him by the title he held in the neighborhood. He doesn't call him by the account he had at his stockbroker. He simply says, child, remember. In other words, part of the reckoning of God is to turn the table on the rich man. The rich man who would not call the name of poor Lazarus is not named even by God in his suffering. I do not strain at this too much, but I do not want you to miss it. God has a way of reckoning with us that is directly proportionate to the way we reckon with other folk. Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. Oh, how we run over those words without remembering the reckoning of God. The reckoning of God. And so God reckons. The rich man said, well, if you're not going to send Lazarus to me, you're not going to come down here and help me, I got some kinfolk who are living like I lived. Send him to them. And Abraham says, no, the time for Lazarus to be about the work of doing your stuff is over. You no longer get a chance to tell Lazarus where to go. I'm not going to have you direct me on what to do with Lazarus. You could have bossed Lazarus during your time, and you could have ignored Lazarus in your time, and you did. And when you had your time, you had folks, I'm sure, like Lazarus, who you bossed. But guess what? You're not bossing me on how to treat Lazarus. Lazarus is with me now. The Lord reckoning with the rich man and said, no, I reckon not. I reckon not. I reckon Lazarus will not be leaving here. I reckon your neighbors, your kinfolks, will have to deal with the prophets. They had the same prophets you had. But Father Abraham, yeah, they had the prophets, but they'll probably repent if they hear from somebody from the dead. And here is this text. If they didn't believe the prophets, how are they going to believe somebody who come back from the dead? And all of a sudden, this comes to us because guess who's saying this lesson? We get this lesson from the guy who came back from the dead. Jesus, the one who came back, is the one who gives us this lesson. Jesus, the one who came back, says, if they didn't listen to Moses and the prophets, they won't listen to me. Don't be surprised if the folks who didn't listen to Moses and the prophets before me don't listen to me. Living in different worlds. Well, no, we live in a world that's like different strokes, but not like different strokes. Yeah, there are Arnold and Willis Jackson people in the world, but we don't have enough Drummonds. And this is a message to those of us who wonder, what's God going to do about that? God's got a reckoning. God's got a reckoning. And we can trust how God reckons. Amen.
Really a story. unbreakable, despite the tides. If the storms don't cease, just in case the wind keeps on blowing in our life, my soul has been anchored in the Lord, in the Lord, in the Lord, my soul has been anchored in the Lord, my soul.
Yeah.
My soul's been anchored. My soul's been anchored. My soul's been anchored. The billows may roll, the breakers may die. I shall not sway because He holds me fast. So dark a day, clouds in the sky. I know it's alright, 'cause Jesus is mine and my soul. My soul, my soul, my soul. You knock me down, but Jesus picks me up. Then He sticks by me when the going gets rough. I say my soul's been anchored. My soul's been anchored. My soul, my